The thing is telling me that we are now live.
Yep. Hello.
People in the chat, let us know if we're coming across
Also
in
nice to know
terms
how
of.
much the lag is. That's always useful.
Oh yeah, there's going to be a little bit of delay, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's always
How
nice to
was
get
that?
feedback from people immediately in the chat so you know how long the delay is. Aha!
Okay, we're apparently live and we sound good.
Do we sound good? Hello, Nemo. I do appear. I don't know how wild I'm going to be. I'm probably relatively tame for my doing in this particular stream.
I mean, I am usually quite sedate and uncharismatic, so
I wouldn't say
it's going to be a
that.
pretty chilled stream.
Yeah, which is a way of saying boring, but we will exactly. We will be very ASMR. You can all go have a nap to our beautiful voices.
I suppose because of the technical difficulties, there won't be any redirect from Miles's stream. Um, so I guess people will just sort of filter in as they can. We've already got apparently 72 viewers.
Yeah, I
So
don't know if Miles managed to redirect or not. People in the chat can probably tell us, but it shouldn't matter anyway for us.
yeah. Cool. So in that
Nap,
case,
exactly.
I guess I will just kick us off with. Um, so as I have mentioned in um, some of the earlier streams that we've had today, I am. First of all, yes, I should say this is the third stream of the day in which someone more qualified than me talks to me about something that I don't know anything about. And in this case, we're talking about economics. Um, and this is part of my enterprise to branch out a little bit and move into topics that I do not have very much knowledge or experience in. And to help me on this quest, I have my good friend McCain slash Matthias with me. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Indeed. I suppose you don't need as much introduction for your audience, but I probably do. So yeah, I'm Matthijs, or McCain for internet purposes. The reason I'm doing this stream with Bib is because for my sins, I have a master's degree and a PhD in economic history. My original background is, well, way back when academically is in philosophy, but then I switched to more material subjects and I went to the London School of Economics and I studied there and I did my PhD. I have also some academic publications under my belt. I turned my PhD into a book with an academic publisher with Palgrave Macmillan. You can all go read that. It is super duper fascinating. I can guarantee you. I have some, book chapters, papers, whatever. And none of that is at the moment very interesting. But yeah, so I did economic history, which for those not in the know, because I often get people wondering what is economic history. Well, it's obviously like you have economic theory and then you have history, and economic history in the same way that you have cultural history, you have art history, you have social history. So you also have economic history. So it's studying the history of economic phenomena in a broad sense. And then later I did also a postdoctoral research project at the Max Planck Institute in Germany in economic anthropology, which I also know a little bit about. And the reason I mention this is because I think both economic history and economic anthropology are at some level more interesting actually for world builders than economics in the sense that we usually think about it is. And so I have a little bit of expertise in this. On the other hand, it has been years since I actually did this professionally, I have to say, and I also just moved house. I'm actually like a boring corporate manager now, believe it or not. So I haven't prepared quite as much and to quite the level of detail as I might have liked. So we're probably going to get a fairly high level overview here. And I hope that the chat and also Bib here will give me some questions and reactions and things.
That's
I will get some things across and I will really try to focus it in particular on what I think is interesting for world building. My main purpose here is not, I want to emphasize this from the start, is not to give an economic theory lecture. I'm not going to give you economics 101. I'm not going to talk about utility and supply and demand curves and any of this fun stuff. But I want to talk rather about like aspects of, I guess, what you might really more call political economy. So aspects of like economy as it relates to social structure, as it relates to a broader sense of how societies hang together, and the kinds of questions that have to do with economics that you can ask of your setting as a way of like developing your world building, right? Because like I was saying to Bib earlier before we started the stream, I really see a lot of these like streams as being particularly useful in the sense that it gives you inspiration for like, hey, here's an aspect of world building that I haven't thought about. Here are some like, dimensions where I can make decisions, right? It's like we just had a stream about architecture, and so you have a dimension there of architecture, like, hey, I haven't thought about like, hey, what could the buildings look like? What sort of materials might they be made of? What what technologies are used in them? What do they like symmetry? Do they not like symmetry? Right? These kind of questions that we were talking about earlier with Hannah Smith. I want to sort of basically focus on getting a bunch of these kind of questions across, but focusing on economics. And
Very good.
then, yeah, if you have anything in particular that you want to specifically want me to focus on, or you want to say something or whatever, then obviously just go for it.
Well, I will say right off the bat, I'm going to issue a very big disclaimer up front because of I have said on previous streams that I consider myself a whatever you call a person who specializes in two things as a double specialist in biology and linguistics. And the further you go from those areas, the less informed I think I am. But if it is possible to have an anti-specialization in something, then for me that is this topic. I don't know why, but in all of my attempts to understand economics that I've tried before, just my brain absolutely refuses to absorb it. There's something about it that just does not click with the way that my brain works. So a lot of the questions that I'm liable to ask will probably be very basic, very stupid, or just irrelevant. So
No, I
just
think that's
you have been warned.
I think that's perfectly fine. I think a lot of people also have this sense about economics, right? I mean, I should add in the background, like I like a lot of other world building too. Like, obviously I have also a lifelong interest in world building. I also do conlanging, as Bip probably knows. One of my conlangs, my non-concatenative language, Izikazi, was featured on David Peterson's Fiat Lingua. I've also been on a couple of the Langtime Studio streams, and we will also be seeing each other again at CopyCon in a month. So that is also
Oh
something
yes, very good.
right? Yeah. That's also something I very much look forward to. And I'm also a big Tolkien knower and opinions about Haver and so forth. So like, it's not like my only interest is in like economics by any means, but much more, I am honestly like a general humanities person. My family are all historians. To make things even worse, they all have PhDs in history, my entire family, all in different kinds of
Wow.
history. I'm the economic history guy. My sister does Mesopotamian history. My
Ooh.
mother does ancient Greek history. My father is an art historian. Just to give you a sense of like, so we're not gonna like in that sense, or at least I hope that I can get across a little bit about what would make economics interesting. And that's actually a good, I think, lead in to get to the point. Let's see if I can move this slide now. Yes, this works, I think. So just a little bit of overview. I have a sort of rough lecture-esque structure that I wanted to follow, just in case, what we need to fill the time, but we don't necessarily need to go over all of this. We probably also won't have time to go over all of this, especially not in any great degree of detail. Like I said, it will be a little bit high level until people pull me down to earth, but mainly because sort of my purpose is to get questions across that you can ask if you're sitting in a little bit about like, how can economics be cool and interesting, exactly because I feel like a lot of people have honestly, in my opinion, justified prejudice against it. So I want to talk a little bit about like, what is economics about, in my opinion, right? You're going to get my take on economics. You're going to get my take on what is relevant for world building. Why should world builders care about it? Talking about reproduction, which is sort of the main, let's say, header under which I want to organize these questions. I want to talk very briefly, because this is a topic I am personally passionate about, even though it's completely a tangent, about magic and economics. This is a bit of a repetition of something I already talked about on a previous LTS stream, but we have a bit of a bigger audience in a different one now. So I want to repeat that. And then I want to sort of break down reproduction into three broad categories, because I think these are the big three categories which make economics interesting and relevant. And that are sort of the big headers for the kinds of questions you can ask, which are production, distribution, and what I have just called conflict and change, or what professionals might call institutions, but that's a bit of a bloodless term. So what is economics and why should you care? So what I want to first begin, I'm going to actually be beginning away with the second point, because I think that's where the real fear comes in some sense. It's like when you think about economics as it's usually represented in textbooks, in society, in lectures and so forth, it's very much about like stupid math stuff with lots of graphs and
Hmm.
curves.
Yeah.
I personally have less than zero interest in any of that. I have studied it. I mean, I know about it. I can do it, but I don't give the slightest shit about any of that. And that's not what I'm going to be talking about here whatsoever. I should also say I'm so much of a humanities person that I have very little interest in natural science in general, I must admit. I like biology the
Mm.
most. I will concede you that. But like as soon as it goes into, what most economists and what most economic theory tries to do, which is to emulate physics, right? It's essentially economics presents itself as if it's a kind of physics of society. And so it uses a lot of the
Mm.
presentation and methods and ideas, with equilibrium curves and so forth, and equations that you find in physics. None of that interests me in any way, and that is not what I'm going to talk about.
That's
What
kind
I
of
want,
the same with
yeah.
biology, because I'm reminded of a quote by Carl Sagan where he
Hmm.
said that biology is a lot more like history than it is like physics. There's
100%,
no,
which is why I like it the most. That's actually
yeah,
exactly
there's
the
no
reason. Like evolutionary
predictive theory of
biology is
biology. Yeah.
right, exactly, because it's actually, in some sense, I feel it's even almost the same field. Like it is, it's just applied, and in a way, you could say this for a lot of the humanities stuff, where biology feels to me often like an extension of this, but like into the realm of nature, quote unquote. But it has
Hmm.
a lot of similarities. In my PhD, I actually also talk about some of this, about evolutionary theories of culture and how they relate to economics. That's going a little far afield right now. I want to first talk about like what is economics for me really about, and this is economics is not about numbers, it's not about math, it's not about graphs, it's not about money. It is about humans. It's about human societies. So this is of course also allowing the humans to be elves and whatever, but you get what I mean. This is
Hmm.
about humanoids, let's say. So it's
And
about human
demi-humans.
societies, exactly. Whatever. It's about human societies. It's about how humans create their societies, how they survive, how they thrive, and how human societies change. And so I present economics, or I would present economics as a theory of social reproduction. And what I mean by that is this, sort of put really bluntly, is for me, economics is about how does a society produce the stuff it needs to survive, so the material goods that it needs to survive. How does it distribute those things among the population? And then the reproduction aspect, this is where the sort of institutional side and all the other aspects of human society and culture come in, the rules of society, the way it's, the organizational level, so to speak, is about how does it do these things in a way that reproduces the society as it is. So you can imagine sort of you have a model of a society, a sort of very simplified model. I mean, economists love models, right? And so you
Hmm.
have essentially a society and it needs to produce stuff that goes into it. The stuff has to be redistributed, and then at some point this cycle starts anew, right? And there is a sort of logic to how societies do this. Every society has its own sort of particular way in which it does this, historically speaking. And that, for me, this then you sort of make it a little bit static in time, but not completely, of course. And this, for me, is what economics is really about. And when we talk about economics for world building, then these are the kind of questions that I would focus on. And what I find particularly interesting for world building and for people who are interested in world building, the typical kind of world builders that I think many of us are, where we have an interest in the creative aspect of world building, the fantastic aspect of world building, and especially the narrative aspect of world building, right? We ultimately, what we want to do is we want to imagine cool societies that could have been or that could be, and we want to tell stories about them. We want to, do stuff within them and tell about individual characters in them or how they, what happened to them and so forth. We want to do a kind of storytelling, but with imagined stuff. It's essentially fantasy, science fiction, but in a creative, applied science kind of way, right? This is what I think motivates almost all of us. And this is
Sure.
where I want to point out in a way how economics can really be cool for this, because economics is about production and distribution, and who gets, who makes stuff and what stuff, and who gets this stuff and who determines these things. These are just sort of three aspects. Because of that, it is automatically also about conflict, because people who have stuff want to keep it. People who don't have stuff want to get it. People who have stuff want to get more, and people who determine who gets what are challenged by other people who would also like to determine who gets what, and and so forth.
Yeah.
And so conflict, this is to me always a very important point to get across. Conflict is built into the understanding of economics, and conflict, not coincidentally, is also, as you will learn in any creative writing class or whatever, conflict is also the heart of all storytelling, right? All storytelling at some level doesn't have to be physical conflict, but all storytelling is about some kind of problem. You have some kind of conflict and you either overcome it or you don't. And so I think really, like, rather than thinking of economics as like, oh, it's this boring stuff with banks and stocks and numbers and shit, it's about thinking about, okay, where's the conflict in this society and how does it emerge? How does this conflict in society emerge out of conflicts about production and distribution and about who sets the rules about production and distribution? There are, of course, also other kinds of conflict that there can be, right? I mean, these are not the only sources of conflict in a society. You have all sorts of cultural, ideological conflict. I mean, interpersonal relations or, whatever, crimes of passion and so forth. Those are things, of course, that are not covered by this, but I do think we can all agree that like a very substantial part in history of conflict and change is actually driven by these kind of struggles about how does production happen, what kind of production is there, who gets this stuff, how much of it do they get, and who determines these things. And so that's sort of the first thing that I want to get across is like, why care about economics? Why why ask these kind of questions? Why is this cool? It's because when you ask yourself these kind of questions, you allow your setting, or yourself as creator of your setting, you allow yourself to think about how do these things work in my setting and how do they produce conflict? And because they produce conflict, how do they produce change? So that's the first thing I want to get across. Any comment or question for you so far?
Not particularly. That all sounds very compelling. And again, it reminds me of, I can't remember who said it, but in the entire history of humanity, we've only ever had one idea for a good story, which is someone wants something very badly and is having difficulty getting it. And framed in this way, that's pretty much, yeah, it comes down to economics in a sense.
Exactly. I mean, this is sort of like, I mean, you can say like economics is of course a subset of this thing because, you have your romanticides or whatever in which this may be less relevant. There are other kinds of things that you can want that aren't necessarily covered by, at least by this approach to economics. But certainly a very substantial amount of them, it's definitely like a major subset of this kind of problem, of this kind of storytelling. And that I think is what makes, to me also, this is what motivates myself also to care about economics and to care also about, especially about economics in a comparative historical way, right? This is where the history and the anthropology comes in. We're not just talking about, or usually we're primarily in our world building context, not talking about modern day economies as they are here in the here and now. You can of course do that, but we're especially talking about like, historical economies, the very different types of society that have been, different societies that could be, the way that anthropologists have talked about different modes of these things. That's sort of what I want to get into. So this, yeah, exactly. This is basically what I already sort of covered. It allows you to think more naturalistically about how your setting works. This is, of course, a sort of advantage about talking about material stuff, is that usually it gives you a certain degree of structure, right, to your setting. It's always difficult when you have a new setting and you're doing world building. Is like, it's the blank page problem. It's like, where do you start? How do you structure
Mm-hmm.
this? Like with conlangs, where you start with your phonology or so forth, or in my case, where you start with the word for owl and then you do your phonology and figure everything else out. This, or like in the case of Easy-Kazi, I just decided, the first thing I decided about it was that the language would be called Easy-Kazi, and then I retconned it so that this would actually make sense.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
just like, yeah, literally, it's like I woke up and I was like, this language is going to be called Easy-Kazi. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that it's certainly one of them, because it's such a big deal, right? Because you could say, in the sort of, everybody knows the memes about like the, what's the damn thing called? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
everybody has seen like the meme versions of this, because, it always starts with the food. Eerst komt das Fressen, dan die Moraal. As Brecht put it, like, because this is such a basic thing, right? Material provision is such a like core aspect of any society, any imaginable society has to do this in some way, even with your replicators or whatever. This is also a very good way of giving yourself some naturalistic structure and, giving yourself limitations, essentially. As soon as you make decisions, you make limitations. And as we all know, a certain degree of limitation is necessary for creativity to work.
Mm-hmm.
And it helps you, as I mentioned, find sources for conflict and change. It interacts very well or in interesting ways with other aspects of a world building that you might be interested in doing, like looking at nature, right? Like biomes, environments, animals, plants, all this kind of stuff. With magic and whether you have it and how it works, with technology, which is in part embedded in it, but can also be partially its own thing. What I want to again emphasize is what I'm not interested in doing here, and what I also do not think is at all necessary, is to think about it in terms of just people's individual self-interest, of what has often been called the homo economicus, the idea of like, oh, we just think about methodologically or purely in terms of like individuals who as individuals make self-oriented choices where they try to maximize their own benefit, right? This is the sort of like way in which a lot of economic theory nowadays is presented and has been for a long time. It's an oversimplification. A lot of more sophisticated economists also do other stuff. I don't want to make it seem as if economics does only this. But there is a lot of, if you take your typical undergraduate textbook or something in economics, it's all going to start with very simple models that are based on this idea. It's individual self-interest, and then the idea that a society can somehow be analytically reduced to the operation of individually self-interested
Mm-hmm.
people, right? Which you as a biologist is a model that you also are familiar with at some level, but you also as a
Sure.
biologist know that there are, emergent properties, so to speak, out of this that don't
Yeah.
operate quite like that. What I'm going to be interested in here is much less this individual level. I think for world building purposes, there are good methodological reasons why I have a problem with this, which I've talked about in academic context. But I think especially for world building, um, it's more interesting to talk often about groups and about group interests or social roles is another way of thinking about the same thing. Or it's like the kind of economic structure of a society creates certain roles out of how it works, and somebody belongs, this can change in their life or whatever, but they belong to certain roles, and they often operate when they operate economically on the basis of these roles. All right, so I guess I should move on a little bit. Talking about reproduction. So here are sort of the very big level questions, which I already want to get out of the way. As I mentioned, we can at any point go more deeply into whatever, but so just to get the main questions out of the way, the questions about production, or the themes of production, the themes of distribution, and the themes of conflict, as I put it here. Under production, I sort of categorize questions about nature, questions about technology, and questions about material surplus. So what is produced? With what technology is it produced? What is not produced, right? What is lacking? What do they not have? And especially the question, what social roles, what sort of groups, who essentially does what kind of production? So these are, to my mind, the sort of big level questions that you want to be asking at the level of production. Then at the level of distribution, under which I share things like exchange, debt, money, trade, essentially everything. When there is stuff already, how does it, who gets what? The stuff that is there, how does it go around? You ask yourself these questions of like, who gets what part of what is produced, right? How is this organized? What determines this? How are goods obtained that are not produced locally, right? The things that are lacking, how do they get them if they need them? And I think this is especially anthropologically also an interesting question. What is tradable and what is not? Because a lot of
Mm.
thinking about economics sort of assumes trade, right? There's a tendency to reduce economics to exchange, which is why, because of this tendency, is why I explicitly put production so front and center as a separate thing. Not because in practice, of course, these things are all part of one society, right? It's not like in time you can say, it's not like in a computer game where they all show up on the map when you start, right? And the little guys go and chop the wood and they mine the stuff,
Mhm.
and then it all goes to the stockpile, right? And then you build your units, and right, it's sort of course, in real history, this is not like there's no moment where you can say that this is the case.
Uh-huh.
It's all part of one thing. But I think analytically, it's very helpful to distinguish these things as separate moments, so to speak, in an analytical sense, because they are quite separate questions to ask about your society, and the one doesn't necessarily imply the other. That's why I present it in this way. And there's also, it's very important to not reduce it just to the operation of trade, because production is important, but there's also other ways of distributing than just trade. And what is important is like in different societies, not everything is necessarily what they call commensurable. So not everything can be traded. Not everything is expressible in terms of a price. Not everything is allowed to be traded. It's not just as a matter of law, but also as a matter of understanding. Like like you would, in the way that we would say stuff like, you can't put a price on human life. Of course,
Mm.
insurance accountants do in fact do that, right? But there is a sort of sense there to us where like there are certain things that are not actually commensurable with other things. You cannot really say
Sure.
like, oh, there's so many bottles of cola is worth a human life, right? You couldn't really, or you shouldn't want to really express how much that is. That seems
Yeah.
odd to us and kind of inappropriate. Now, societies may have all sorts of ideas about these things, and not necessarily everything is commensurable. So that's also a question to ask. And then the conflict, which I put here, institutions, power, inequality. These are essentially, I put it in this way of like who makes what and who gets what, and then finally about who sets these rules, who determines these things. And that's essentially the level of where power, politics, institutions, and things like that come into it. How do you increase your share of the pie within the parameters of a society, right? How do you get ahead? But also, how do you change who is in charge? How do you change who gets what? How do you change what is how things work in that regard? And also very important for when we've already talked a lot about stratification and inequality in other streams. Very important also when we talk about surplus and about the way that societies have historically evolved is to talk about, this is kind of a Marxist concept, but it also appears in other kinds of economics, is exploitation, which is essentially, it sounds sort of negative, but you can use it in a kind of technical way, which means essentially there is a surplus and you have certain layers of society that live off of that surplus that do not themselves take part in the production process,
Mm.
but they do other stuff. Um,
Right.
which very quickly emerges, right? I mean, you don't need a whole lot of surplus or a very complex, quote unquote, society for that to be the case. You can think here about not just sort of like fat cats who sit on their ass, but you can also think about like priests, bureaucrats, soldiers.
Hmm.
There's loads and loads of aspects
Craftsman.
of. Yeah, exactly. Even like in the sense of like people who are engaged in the sort of aspects of distribution that like need to happen physically, but that don't themselves produce more stuff, right? And so a lot of conflict is also about this because that inherently implies a sort of distributional conflict. And I think it's very important when you try to make sense of the sort of sociology of your society. You think about if you think about it again in terms of a little toy model of like little bricks get made and then little bricks get distributed around and people do stuff with it, that like some people get more and some people get less, but there's also some people getting more allows them to do other stuff because they're not spending all their time tilling the land, or
Sure.
what most people in most of the time in agricultural society have done, or they're not doing hunting and foraging as even people have done for even longer. So that's that. Now, if you don't have any immediate interruptions, I'm going to go on a rant about magic.
Oh boy. I guess the only little thing I had so far, we might address this later, in which case feel free to just delay this until we talk about it. But the difference between exchange and debt just down to essentially a delay in time? Like rather than immediately exchanging something between two participants, it's one of them gives something now and the other gives something later, or is there more nuance to it than that?
Yes, I mean, yes and no, I would say in a sense, yeah, exactly. I mean, exchange is usually just, technically speaking, you usually just mean with it the very fact of the exchange of something, right? Of goods for something else. Um, in the sense that like debt can be subsumed under this, in the sense that you can exchange in exchange for debt, which is historically very common, that you don't necessarily pay anything on the spot, but you have a certain
Mm-hmm.
debt to somebody. But debt is also, of course, a larger category because it also comes or covers social obligation. And this is
Mm.
interesting in the sense that, and I will come to this in a little bit. This is actually a very interesting point that I want to address to in a little bit more detail. Is that uh, in a sense, debt, social obligation predates debt in a sense, right? Like any society has a concept of social obligation, and debt in an economic sense can be seen to be a special case of a more general sense of social obligation. And a lot of like understanding of early economic history, for example, the emergence of money and the emergence of like sort of monetized exchange, um, comes out of trying to understand how the social obligation side of debt turns into the economic side of debt. And the economic side of debt, in turn, fuels a certain kind of process in society. Because the economic side of debt, for example, leads to things like you have to have accounting, right? Because you're keeping track of who owes what. You get like obviously all the mathematical stuff that comes with this, but you also get like the need for ways of settling these debts eventually, because people cannot
Mm.
forever have a notional debt to each other that is not actually fulfilled or settled in some way. And this is how you get the rise of the need for a means of payment. And one of the main roles that money, but also other kinds of commodity monies play, is to allow people to settle their social debt with each other, a social debt that manifests itself as an economic debt. Does that make sense?
Mm. I think so.
So there is like, certainly there's a temporal aspect, and this temporal aspect is important when you think about insurance, when you think about interest rates, when you think about loans, right? A lot of this is about like taking risk because you advance somebody money and you want it back later, and then you may or may not get it back. So you want something in return for this. But there's also the aspect of like exchange is sort of the fact that goods are exchanged against one with people against one another. Um, but debt is a sort of larger category which flows from society or from social ideas of obligation into the material world of exchange. And that interaction creates a lot of the sort of interesting, how that works in a particular society is quite socially specific. And this is where a lot of the juice is, right? This is where a lot of the interesting stuff happens.
Cool.
Okay, now I'm going to rant about magic. I already see that
Mm.
like a bunch of people are commenting on this. Um, it's true, magic doesn't have to be completely free energy, but the important thing about magic is this. Um, my experience is that like I talked about economics as giving you constraints, right? And magic is, this is sort of my understanding of it. The thing with magic is that even though you can have magic systems which have particular requirements, there's like a million different Sanderson style magic systems or whatever, where
Mm-hmm.
you have to do a special spell or you have to use special resources or all this kind of stuff. It's all good and well, but in some sense, any kind of magic, by definition, creates a sort of supernatural working of energy, right? That isn't, or you can either transmute things in a way that you cannot normally do, or you create free energy in some other respect. You're doing something that is outside a normal material production and distribution process. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason this matters is because economics, sort of as it is, right? Because it is about normal naturalistic human processes, isn't very well set up to address this, because magic is sort of like an additional economics, right? You see what I mean? Like magic is its own economic system.
Hmm.
When you say you have magic and you have, where you have to use five bits of particular alchemy and then you can cast fireball or whatever, then you have created your own economy, which is next to the economy of what these bits of alchemy would materially mean and how they are produced and so on in a normal naturalistic sort of context. And this isn't a bad thing. Like this, I'm not saying that I don't like, I'm a huge fantasy reader, right? And I like magic. There's nothing wrong with magic per se. But I just want to caution people that before you, and this is, for example, relevant when we think about the pillar economics, which we'll go into tomorrow.
Oh, yes.
The more you go into high magic or sort of traditional fantasy, big flashy stuff, and the more you have a kind of magic which works as a kind of free energy, and that also then includes things like replicators and indistinguishable from magic, right? This kind of stuff. The less the constraints that these kind of economic questions impose on you work. And so while on the one hand magic is cool, and I also think magic is cool, on the other hand, I want to tell people, and this is just an aspect of thinking economically that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about when they make decisions about magic in their world, and that's ultimately what this stream is about, right? Is about thinking about world building, is that a lot of people don't think about how magic on the one hand and economics on the other hand create then this kind of tension, because at the heart of economics is essentially, like you say, it's like people want something and they don't get it, or they're trying to get it, right? So there is a sense of scarcity in this. It has often been called like the science of scarcity and blah blah blah. It's all a little bit bloated, I think, but there is a truth to it, that economics is always by definition about things that are not indefinitely available. It's about something
Hmm.
where people have to put in effort to get it. There is a conflict over distribution of it. People want it, and this is effortful. And magic sort of has a tendency to do the opposite of that. It sort
Mm.
of obviates scarcity in some sense, or it creates solutions where there was not a solution, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not that the one is good and the other is bad, but it is just about helping you think about world building. The more you have your magic do, the less your normal economic system does. And so when you want to start thinking about things in an economic way, and this is, because you can then draw on all of economic history and so on, there are certain advantages to doing this. And I think personally, as I mentioned, it's very interesting. The more you want to do that, the less you can have your magic solve your problems for you as well. Or you have to think very carefully about how both of these exist at the same time. And Magpie
Mm.
already mentions D&D, which are
Yes.
similar kinds of. That is a classic problem, right? Where it's like, on the one hand, we have like a feudal society with normal, feudal cities and caravans and whatever, all cool stuff, stuff that we all like because it's cool, and that is cool. And you have all of these kind of like, for whatever reason, we're in 1400 era technology, or sometimes we're in 1100
Hmm.
technology, or sometimes in 1600. We can't really make up our mind, especially not if we are in the Forgotten Realms. Well,
Oh
don't get
boy.
me start. Don't get me started on that. Anyway, the point is, we do all of this stuff, but then we also have create water as a cantrip, right? Which you can do for free
Yeah.
for you can do for free forever. And it's a bit like, hmm,
And there's ones that give you
how
like free food. I can't remember what the name of the spell
exactly
is,
right?
but
There's
it creates a meal for you.
exactly
You
create a
know.
meal. There's like a cube of food or whatever nonsense. Like there's a lot of this kind of stuff, right? And it's all cool. It's all cool, and it's ultimately because it's a dungeon crawling game where that's what it comes out of, and blah blah blah. So fine. Nothing wrong with all that. And I like playing D&D. This is also good. But you can quite easily see where the problem would be, right? It's like once you start doing this kind of stuff, it becomes kind of tough to then make sense of how your society hangs together. And it's the same thing when you get at more advanced levels of things. Like, if you can, there's all these spells that create types of walls and barriers and so forth. And while you can do cool stuff with this and think about like, okay, you can block a trade route with this and what would that do and so forth, right? It also means that like, does that mean that all the bricklayers are unemployed now, right?
Yeah.
Hmm?
I
Hmm?
mean, with the extent to which in games like D&D magic is available, like the number of wizards that you can just bump into just walking
Right?
down the street, and you don't even need to be a good wizard to be able to do that. As long as you're just first level, you have access to plenty of these spells. So yeah, it's not
Yeah, and it's
particularly
like,
consistent.
right, and it's just an economic principle essentially that like in a sort of, in any society, the more you're free of something you can produce, or generally the more of something you can produce, the price of it will tend to zero, right? And so you end up with very odd discrepancies between things that have value and things that don't have value. And like, why not just make an industry that consists entirely out of wizards, whom you have chained to a to a production chain, and you just have to cast over and over again, right? I mean, this is sort of what people would actually end up doing. But that
Yeah,
doesn't make for a very cool setting, I think, generally speaking. I mean, you can do this, and maybe there is something cool to be had there, or something Terry Pratchett-esque or something. But I just want to, like, this is a little aside where I just want to make people aware of this um, sort of conflict, or sort of structural conflict between these two concepts. Just to think about magic as a separate economic system that exists in some sense orthogonal to, or even in friction with, what we normally think of in economics.
very good.
All right, having said all that, let's get into some more of the business. As I said, I will not go into super big detail on everything necessarily because we only have an hour and a half and I've already used half of that. So let's get on with this. So here are, for me, the main excuse me, the main kind of questions to ask. I want for all of these, for each of these areas, I want to first define what I see as like the main questions that are interesting. So first we want to talk about production. I just start with production. So we have nature, we have technology, and we think about the surplus. So how do we think about this for a given setting? Imagine we have a setting, you're thinking about your setting in your head, and what kind of questions can you ask yourself about your setting that are that help you think about the economic aspect of it. I'm really starting, at this basic level, just like what kind of
Sure.
questions are there? Because, like you said, you said you have basically no real way of thinking about this. You have trouble thinking in
Yeah,
these terms,
exactly.
and that's why I try to focus in this way, as it were, not on what is the economic theory, but rather about how do we think in these ways
Yeah.
about a society? What are the dimensions here that we address? Together with all the other stuff, the food, the architecture, all this other stuff. Just think about it as dimensions of questions to address.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Jake. So the first question I would ask is like, what resources are used? And we think, of course, I mean, some of us have already done this in some of the streams. You think about staple foods, of course. I would say the most natural thing is to think about food first. We think about plants, right? We think about like, what do they clothe themselves in? What do they make their buildings out of? Sort of staple basic goods
Mm-hmm.
of various kinds. We think about minerals, which ones are available, which ones do they use, both the modeling and also artifaction. Other people's world building guides have done a lot of good stuff about how you can know, right, in a particular context, what kind of minerals might be available in a certain natural setting. This all depends, of course, on the natural context in which we're operating, and a little bit also on what kind of species we're working with. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to work with humans here, just because
Sure.
it's the easiest, right? But you can obviously mutatis mutandis adapt as you like. Um, Minerals, things that material. When I say minerals, really, it's also in a more broad sense, like materials that you make tools out of, materials that you make equipment out of, materials that they use to be as intermediaries, essentially, between themselves and the world. Which, in all sorts of ways, we're thinking about hammers, we're thinking about nets, we're thinking about carts, we're thinking about planes. It depends on the tech level, whatever we're talking about. I tend to veer, of course, a little bit towards the more historical stuff. So most of my examples tend to be a bit more on the low tech side, but essentially these questions are just as relevant if you have a more higher tech
Mm-hmm.
thing, as long as it's not completely post scarcity, right? And replicators and
Yeah.
whatever, then anything goes.
And then that runs into the magic issue again.
Exactly. Then we have this problem, and then these questions are not so interesting or relevant. But I'm assuming a situation where these questions are interesting and relevant. And then what I often find interesting also in this context is to think about special resources. Here, the example I give is, spice in Dune, which is very much like, Dune is a high-tech setting in some sense, although it's also a little bit cheating, right? Because it does a lot of actually low-tech fantasy stuff disguised as high-tech stuff, kind of in the same way that Star Wars does.
I was going to say just like Star Wars.
Exactly, just like Star Wars, right? Which is a fantasy story that pretends to be a science fiction story. This is a little bit, Dune has this a little bit also. And one of the ways that it does this, or essentially how Frank Herbert makes this possible, is by just arbitrarily saying, well, there's this special resource which all of our high-tech stuff needs, right? Is our oil or our carbon, fossil fuel, essentially. It's our thing that everything needs. And there's only this one place you can get it. And you have to get it, you have to get it with big diggers and all this kind of stuff. Like that's properly high-tech. But essentially, it's just like, it's the special resource, it's the special mana pool, it's the whatever. That, historically, there have been very many examples of these kind of special resources that actually played a very substantial role in how people, what people did. I can give some historical examples also. One of the very earliest long distance trade routes that we know of is the amber route, or at least that I know of, is the amber route, which already existed in the early Bronze Age, already in the Chalcolithic, really, almost in the Neolithic, which essentially trades amber from northern Europe, the Baltic area, back towards the Mediterranean. And it's like one of the first really sort of longer distance trade routes that we have archaeological evidence for. And
Wow.
this was because amber was actually just one of the main aesthetic things. As far as I know, it's just an aesthetic thing, but it was a very major, probably had ritual significance, right? We've talked about this ritual object, but at least it also had clear sort of aesthetic significance. And so people went very long ways and made very long distance trade routes just to get the amber from somewhere else to there. Another example is in the Bronze Age. You cannot have bronze without tin, right? And tin is a relatively rare material. What's the other one, right? Copper and tin, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, tin, I think.
Yeah. And so tin is the rare one. And, so like in the European context or sort of broad Eurasian context, Western Eurasian context, tin appears in Cornwall and not a lot of other places. And so you have to set up this kind of long distance trade route to go get it, because it's like a place where you have a lot of this stuff and you need it for what you're doing. So those are like, that immediately gives you interesting things to think about. What do they need? Nowadays, we have the same problem with oil that's in certain places and not in other places. And this creates very curious political situations and economic problems when that's in one place and not in another place. These are sort of classic, this gives you already a lot of interesting stuff you can think about, also not just for your own society, but also about how your society relates to other societies and what they have to do. Second point, location. This is already a little bit comes into the same thing. It determines your needs and limitations. Think of deserts, whatever. In Dune, of course, the whole gimmick with the desert planet and so on. Transport is obviously a big thing when we think about pillar economies, right, or pillar societies. Like, how do you get from your one pillar to the next one? Obviously, historically, transport, especially over sea, has been by far the most important thing. It's very interesting how almost every fantasy story overwhelmingly takes place in land journeys, right? Have you ever noticed that like epic fantasy is almost always land journeys? But historically,
now that you mention it.
that makes very little sense, because almost all sort of bulk transport of any kind is cheaper over sea. Even now, this is the case, right, with container shipping. And this was much more so the case in the past. Traveling over land is slow, expensive, dangerous, difficult. Going over sea is important. So rivers, natural harbors, these are places where historically cities occur, right? These are places where people come together. We have this whole in the Fens in England, right? In East Anglia, where they have found these archaeological sites of like massive towns on pillars and stuff like this, because it's like, now it's like in the middle of a swamp and no one goes there. But historically, that was a big intersection of rivers, and so there was a lot of river trade there, and so that's where people actually want to live. And here again, of course, materials come into it. With stone, wood, clay, what sort of materials do they have for building stuff? Energy sources, I think, is always a really good question to ask yourself. Wood, coal, turf, oil, gas, depending on what tech level we're talking about. And then talking about technology more in general terms, that comes into this stuff. What kind of transport tech? Very important always, where I would start when thinking about technology, is the level of agricultural productivity. Like, what sort of agricultural equipment do they have? How do they harvest? What kind of things do they harvest? Is it a rice culture, a grain culture, a taro culture, whatever? and how efficient are they at this. Agricultural productivity is probably the single greatest sort of lever of historical change in economic history. You could, in a very, very, very oversimplified but blunt way, you could say that in the same way that all of history is the history of class struggle, all of history is the history of agricultural productivity, in a sense, at least since agriculture, right? So this is always like one of the biggest places to start thinking about technology, and your whole technology complex to some extent comes out of this. Although you can have, particular anomalies like the having a wheel or not having a wheel, right? In particular contexts, you can have a good agricultural society and yet not have the wheel, as we know. So it's not all just that, but it's definitely one of the biggest ones. And then all of this combined determines essentially how much surplus is there, which in turn, tells you how much room is there for people to do other stuff rather than doing agriculture or producing this stuff, how much room is there for people to do other things than immediate production, and what is the surplus, what is the stuff that we make. Here are some historical notes. I'm not going to read all of these things, I will obviously later also put up the slides for anybody who's interested. These are just like random things that came to mind that are interesting for like little tidbits of world building. One of the things that you asked me before we started, or at least as a thing to talk about, was the question of surplus. Like, how does surplus arise and how does it work actually, right? Because you are curious about like, how is it that there is a surplus in the first place?
Yeah.
So obviously, to some extent, this is a mists of time kind of thing, and I'm not completely a paleontologist, but my understanding is the following. For however hundreds of thousands of years, or less so if you count behavioral modernity only, we are just foraging societies or hunter-gatherers. But what really makes a difference in human history is at some point the Ice Age ends, or at least calms down, right? And the Ice Age is such a big bottleneck in a very large part of human of the world, not everywhere, but in a large part of the world. And you see with the decline of the Ice Age, you see that there is a slow but steady increase in the amount of surplus that you can just get by the natural way, so to speak, by foraging. There always was a surplus and we know this because of the simple fact that um, people have always taken care of children, right? So there has to be a surplus to some extent. That's just given, effectively without a surplus, you cannot live at all because you always have to take care of children. You always have to take care of like emergencies and what have you. You cannot live purely at the max.
Sure.
And what I think is important to point out is that historically there have always been, there is archaeological evidence that people have always taken care of people who are disabled or who have reduced productivity.
Like
So that,
Shanador 1.
yeah, exactly right. I mean, there's these examples of cases where people visibly couldn't walk very well, right, and that they still live until they're 50 or whatever, whatever is reasonable, right? And this is evidence that these people are cared for, and that people people distribute to them in the terms that I've been using, and that requires also a surplus by definition. So in some sense, there's always a surplus. What you do see then is with the declining of the Ice Age, you get also these kind of semi-nomadic patterns where people start more and more controlling their environment in order to produce not just more surplus per se, but it begins with a more regular supply. The real problem you have as a human is you don't know, you can travel around as nomads or whatever, but you don't know what's around the corner. You don't know if you're going to be able to live on it or not. So a big part of what you want is to regularize things, to control a regular supply. And my understanding is that the development of agriculture probably comes originally from sort of selective, sort of semi-artificial selection already preceding a fully sedentary agricultural society, right? People already start trying to ensure that the crops are there when they need them next time they come in the spring, or whatever, this kind of thing. Where people try to adjust their environments in such a way that it provides for them in a more reliable way. And the more you do this, the more you sort of naturally ensure more surplus. And then it becomes a matter of storing surplus and so on and so forth.
And it's the same with like seasonal nomads that set up
Exactly.
semi-permanent bases in
Exactly.
areas that they return to on a seasonal basis, and they always go to wherever
Right.
there is the most abundance, in accordance with that particular time of year.
Exactly, and they also control those things, right? I mean, they know these areas, and they affect these areas in such a way that they know that in the spring we're there, in the summer we're there, in the in the fall we're there, and we know that these things will provide for us because they make sure that they do. And so this kind of semi-nomadic life, and this kind of semi-sedentary stuff is probably, and also coincides for a long time with agriculture, right? In Europe, people who did agriculture and people who did this lived side by side on a sort of big scale for thousands of years.
Yeah.
So this is essentially, very much in a nutshell, how you can get surplus. And as James Oakley rightly points out, like a lot of technology also predates essentially agricultural society. So there is already a lot of, the trend, so to speak, is already there. It just is an extension of the same principle, but but one that makes a very big qualitative change. Just to hit some other notes that are here. What's interesting? Yeah, one thing that I think is for world building interesting to note, this is a little bit crudely put, but here I formulate it as a rule of thumb. The lower your tech level is, this is also why I tend to think that low tech levels are interesting, and I think most fantasy writers tend to agree in practice. The lower your tech level is, the more your sort of natural environment and specific conditions of your environment matter for the shape, the structure of society, and the more these questions become distinct. Essentially, more distinct societies are from each other, right? This is also sort of anthropological thing why anthropologists have to go into the jungle and whatever, nowadays, or like find uncontacted people, quote unquote, and this kind of thing, because it's like it becomes harder and harder to find societies that are not in many ways very similar to each other. And this simply has to do with the way that technology makes it possible to, obliterate distinctions of time and space and of transport and a lot of these kind of things that normally inhibit leveling, right? It's a little bit like what you also know from biology, the kind of island effect that you've talked about.
Yes.
with island competition, right? Where like islands can become these little niches that do their own thing. And in linguistics, we also know this, right? Where you have playing areas, so to speak, where like one language family would just spreads all over the place, and you have little dips with dialects and so on. Like mountain areas tend to do this. You can sort of imagine it the same way for economic technological complexes. This is very crude, of course. It's a simplistic model, but you can kind of think of it in the same sense.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. Then talking about technology, I think one thing that's very interesting to point out or to address is that don't just think of technology as an exogenous factor, like there is a technology level and we just have this, and that's how it is. It is interesting to also think about how that changes and how that comes about in the first place. Like one of the really interesting things in economic history is the way that technology also responds to social, what I call here social pull factors, essentially into incentives that exist in the society itself. So you can think here, the examples I give are, or you can think of countless examples of mathematics developing out of wanting to do better architecture, right? Better building projects and things like this, but also, for example, to satisfying a cultural religious need for astrology, demand to like know what the stars are doing and to attach meaning to this. Engineering that the Romans developed to develop their military purposes, like wars and military are often big drivers of technological change. Navigation for the long distance trade or for exploration or conquest, which are often the same thing, or have the same kind of motivations. Navigation technology is often a very big thing. How do we get the thing that's over there to here, or how do we go there ourselves, right? And these are big questions of like the thing that we don't have. How do we get it? Either we go get it or they bring it to us. How do we get it over the mountains? Or if they ask us, they want a lot for it, can we get it ourselves so that we don't have to pay so much for it? How do we do that? How do we get there? These are like, within the society, there are very big kind of pull factors that can then encourage or incentivize people to develop technology. Another very big one historically is labor saving technology, right? It's like you have to use large amounts of labor on whatever kind of production, and this can cause problems because, for example, people can refuse to do it. or they can, or they can band together and be like, well, fuck you, we want more, right? Before we will build your pyramid, you better pay us more beer and barley or whatever, or this kind of thing. Or people themselves have to do an enormous amount of hard work, and they try to themselves innovate ways to save themselves effort. We talked already about textiles in another stream, about weaving and this kind of stuff, like how tough that work is and how much it is. And so people themselves also, not just like rulers and so forth, but also people themselves, like working people, having incentive to want to save labor sometimes. Just so this is always a very big pull factor. Also, it's just sheer effort. It's a hard life, right? Most of history is grim, hard work all day, and then you die. I mean, it's still a little bit that way, but it has actually improved if you compare to history. I'm not usually very nostalgic, to be honest, in this respect. And so, like, just being able to save yourself or others a lot of work is also a very big factor. And so this is also a question you can ask of your society, is like, if it works in a particular way and they have, I don't know, huge monumental building projects that you have come up with because you like architecture, how do they save themselves a lot of effort on building these things, right? What kind of rollers, what kind of cranes do they develop? How does that work? Like, think of how they build Gothic cathedrals, for example, with very advanced cranes and scaffolding structures. Or you think about like, oh, we have the laboring underclass of the worker ants or whatever, and then it's like, okay, but what if these people decline to do the work, right? What happens then? Or like, so there's like interesting aspects like there, and like how could people try and like, in modern history of sorts, since industrial revolution, labor-saving technology as a way of undermining, sometimes deliberately, sometimes not deliberately, undermining set ways of working. It's quite important. The Luddites in England are a very interesting example. Anyway, I need to move on because I can go on forever about this. What is the last thing I want to mention is that it's very important to remember that historically you see different production types, often very mixed. The sort of neoclassical way of thinking about economics tells you that everything is just a form of capitalist production. It's just more or less efficient. The sort of traditional Marxist way of thinking about it, the kind of received Marxist view, is like, first you have sort of primitive life, and then you have slavery, and then you have feudalism, and then you have the Industrial Revolution, and they start using machines, right? In reality, the picture, this is not all untrue, but in reality, the picture is much more complicated, and you find that very often different kinds of production coexist. So state-driven production exists in antiquity with various big projects. Wage labor, quite common in antiquity also. Romans used extensive wage labor next to slavery. They had both. In the Middle Ages, you see slavery and wage labor both, and also payment in kind, right? Feudal serf labor. All of these things mixed together. As we probably in the world building world all know, the pyramids were not all built by slaves, but people were mostly paid. They had to do it, but they were paid, and so forth. Like, these things all exist together. All right. Then distribution. Trying to hurry up a little bit, I guess. Two types of distribution, very roughly. I want to sort of just hit the high notes here because I think it's mostly, this is in some sense the most complicated or the most abstract part, but I think it's very important here to make some analytical distinctions which are useful because we don't tend to think of them in this way. And I think they're very important for understanding how historically societies were different from each other, which is what we're interested in as world builders, I think. So you have two types of distribution, essentially, which I will call trade and non-trade. Trade being, essentially you give and you get something back, right? In a sort of immediate way. This can be also delayed, but in the sense of like exchange, what I just mentioned. And then non-trade is sort of my term here for all of the other ways of distributing that exist, right? Because you can also think about other ways of distributing. Rationing, state distribution of various kinds. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. Gift economies, like various aspects of the gift. The famous anthropologist Marcel Mauss has an essay or a book on that is called The Gift, which I can very much recommend everybody to read who is interested in economic anthropology. It's a classic book, which is very much about, like, both in contemporary but also historically, and this is basically what we come into, where social obligations are sometimes just what they are, right? I mean, say you go to someone for a visit and you bring your bottle of wine, right? I mean, they do, you go there, you bring your wine or you bring your flowers or whatever. If you then send them the bill afterwards, it's a little, I mean, either you're Dutch or it's rude, right? So like there are things like gifts, and of course historically, this is a grody, a silly example, but historically gifts can be quite important because gift economies and gift aspects are quite an important social um, expectation in many cases. I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned here also, I wrote here potluck, that should of course be potlatch. Um, the potlatch where you have to demonstratively give back as a distributional pattern, right? This is a way of avoiding the accumulation of wealth in a ruling class. You can have an elite that you want to avoid as a society, or you have a social rule that you want to avoid as accumulation. So you force them in order to maintain their elite status to give stuff. This is also something you see, for example, in the European early Middle Ages. If you read Beowulf or similar text, you see a very important emphasis put on the king as a gift giver or the ruler as a gift giver. In Beowulf, there's constantly the mention of like he's a giver of gifts. He gives many rings and treasures to his followers. Right? He has a retinue. There's a king using a hall. He has this big wooden hall, and there's a bunch of guys sitting at the table around him who drink his beer, and who sleep on his floor and who eat his food, and he has to give them stuff, and then they will follow him and they will acknowledge him as the ruler of the land. And he has to
Ah.
do that. And he has to do that. That's a social rule. So this is also important. These are the non-trade forms. And then you can think of, probably you can think of a lot of new ones that I haven't even thought of. This is a very creative area where you can come up with like what are non-trade ways of distributing stuff. How would it work? The trade ones are, of course, the best ones that we know best. I will not go into great detail in that because we know what that is. The main distinction I want to make here is between long distance trade and local trade. This is again a very simplified model, but I think it will help you think about societies, world building. Usually local trade is essentially any kind of staple trade, usually in basic goods, of all sorts of basic goods, textiles, food, whatever, among people that are part of your community that you know and that you can enforce rules on each other, right? Your social norms, your laws, your religious expectations, your whatever. This is part of the in-group. And you do local trade with these people, and historically speaking, most of this kind of trade is done on the basis of debt and credit, which can eventually be settled often at fixed moments with money or with other valuable means. But it tends to be, like we were talking about earlier, this tends to be an extension of a system of social obligation and debt, social debt, so to speak, that already exists. It's part of one system until capitalism. But in a broad sense, this is like a society. People have obligations towards each other. People know already what you're meant to be doing. Like the Lord owns the land, but the Lord also owes the peasants the right to gather wood for their fires in the forest, right? And they have the right to let the pigs roam and eat the acorns in the forest. But the nobleman has the right to hunt in the forest, right? And if you then go hunt in the forest as a peasant, we hang you, right? And so this is all like part of a larger set of ideas about who am I, what is my role in society, and and this is monetary, partially it's a matter of money and exchange, but it is a part of a larger system. The other thing is long distance trade, which is the trade that is essentially with strangers, with people who are not part of the community that I do not know, whom I cannot very easily enforce rules on. And this is the distance that's also physically long distance, right? This is stuff that comes from further away. This has, as I mentioned, has existed for thousands of years in all sorts of forms and intensifies over time, and historically has been an enormous driver of transport, of immigration, of development, of exploration. I don't need to go into all that. We all know that. The distance there is that, or the difference there is that the long distance trade, because it is with people that you don't know, it tends to not be so driven by the rules of social obligation of a particular society. It almost always inherently means you have to pay upfront or you have to pay on arrival. So the more you have this, the more you need some kind of money or some means of payment to do it, right? Because you need to pay these people who show up, and it has to be something that they will accept, that they can take back home, and that they can use in turn over there.
That kind of relates to a question I was going to ask about the how kinship factors into all of this, because I would imagine that generally speaking, people will be much more willing to enter into I guess, unfair or unequal exchanges with those that they are close with versus those that are far away or that they're not particularly closely related to.
Yeah, I mean, again, right? Because it's like social obligations, which, of course, familial and patriarchal or other kinds of whatever they are, ideas about family and kin are also part of this kind of culture of social obligation towards one another, right? Where it's like you share with the family in a way that you wouldn't share with others, right?
Mhm.
This is sort of, I think, what you're getting at, where it's like you have, or like you hold a feast, or you come into a lot of money, then you're obliged. This is in a lot of societies a big cultural pull, right? If you come into a lot of money, there's an expectation that your cousin and so on will also benefit, right? This is
Mhm.
popes start appointing their cousins to cardinal positions because they're Italian families, and the cousin comes by and is like, "Hey, you're the pope now. Hey, give me something." Yeah, this is like exactly. Whereas with strangers, you don't have this so much, right? Because it's like, who are you? I have no idea. Maybe I'll never see you again. Makes it also hard to have fair trades, right? So this is a very sharp point. This is a point of a lot of conflict, and people are keeping an eye on each other, what everybody's doing, and this is and gives a lot of opportunity for arbitrage. So this
Mhm.
yeah, essentially this is like I would say the kinship goes into, and the other aspect of kinship, which I don't really have a lot of time to go into in detail, but which is important to keep in mind, is inheritance. Inheritance is
Mhm.
one of the main reasons why property exists, right, as a concept. The idea of property develops historically very much around, and the rules of property develop almost entirely around inheritance. And also this includes property in people, including also patriarchal property ideas about women and so forth. Like all the property in a broad sense develops very largely around inheritance, because property is about not just who has it, but also who gets it after you. And so this is also a big question that you should always ask yourself. I don't mention it here, but now that you bring it up, this is always a question also to ask yourself in world building. When you have when you have production, you have distribution. It's not just a trade aspect, but there's also the inheritance aspect of like people,
Mhm.
this is the time aspect, so to speak. How does this stuff go then from one generation to the next? And making decisions on this point has enormous implications, or at least give you a lot of opportunity for enormous implications about um, how people treat in general property rights, how people see, family lines and lineages, right? Like, is there patrilineal inheritance or not? And, is it equally distributed? Is the land equally distributed? Does the oldest one inherit? Does the youngest one inherit? Anybody who has played Crusader Kings will know how important this is. Like, this is also a very major driver of developing ideas about what is property and what goods are. And of course, this then ends up playing its own role in trade, but also playing its own cultural role about, like I said, because property is a concept that easily extends metaphorically or really to a lot of other things.
Mhm.
And so you can have religious property. In ancient Greece, you had also things that were property of the gods. That
Oh.
this is a very fun thing. My mother has done a lot of research on this, because you had things that were like essentially run in practice, of course, by temple people, but it was officially God's property. It was divine stuff. They owned it. And so that had special rules about what you can do with it and who can get it and who can use it.
Wow.
Right. So that's also an idea that you can have. And this is sort of, I should really, I guess, have mentioned this here also. It's in that sense good that you mention it. But like, this is also, this is internally, when you talk about non-trade, this is also a very major distributor, is how after people's death, or
Mhm.
or collective ownership in by holding in trust and so on, like you do with temple ownership. So then I want to go into one more thing before we completely run out of time, in the aspect of distribution, which is the point of money. And this is always a cause of enormous amounts of confusion, because money is a very complicated thing, especially modern money is the most complicated way that it has ever appeared, which is why I think part of the reason why people find economics very difficult is because we think of economics as being about money, and modern money and everything that comes with it is an incredibly complicated business. But I think for world building and historical purposes, it's useful to distinguish two different aspects of money. And one is money as the means of exchange. And this is usually some form of commodity money, as they call it, which is essentially like when you are doing trade, you never have just a barter economy. There's this kind of story of like, well, people used to just barter in goods, right? And then at some point this became inconvenient, and so they started inventing coins to make it possible to like exchange more easily. And so this has never existed. Like there has never been a society that is just a barter society, because it's so obviously inconvenient and impractical that has never worked. So that has just never arisen in the first place. What you had instead is first you have the societies, which when you're only within your own community, then you have these debt obligations. And then eventually these debt obligations, they become, and as more and more stuff gets around and more stuff is there, and you trade also more with others, this becomes more and more complicated. And so you want stuff that makes it easy to measure how much of X is a Y worth, right? You have these ratios of
Yeah,
exchange that naturally happens. You want to exchange X for Y amount of stuff. You need to have some way that is conducive to making this happen physically and conducive to making measurement possible.
I do
And they
have
have
a question
yeah,
about
yeah,
this, but I'll save it for the end because it's not
sure,
particularly relevant.
do that. I will just quickly finish and then we can get on that. And then basically you have all sorts of commodity monies that have historically arisen to do this, from torques to, coins, and later you get things like paper money, whatever, cattle, cowrie shells. You get this in all sorts of places, things that allow you both to measure a certain amount and to exchange. So that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it is what we were talking about. When you have a debt, there's a social obligation. At some point, you need to be able to fulfill this debt, right? You need to be able to cross it off and say, done, we've settled it. And so you also need something that allows you to do this, which may or may not be the same thing. This again, in your own world building, you can decide whether this is the same thing or not. James Oakley, I will get to your point at the end of the stream. Um, you can decide whether that's the same thing or not. And there's two other aspects that I mentioned here, which I think are interesting to think about, because it's not just settling social obligations towards one another, but there are two major drivers also of money and monetization historically, which is the obligation to pay taxes to a state. You have to pay the state in something. And although this can also be in kind, and historically often was in kind initially, at some point this becomes inconvenient. And the reason it becomes inconvenient is the other reason, which is that states in turn want to pay soldiers and also workers. When you have state projects, the states, you have your big emperor and he wants to build the pyramids or whatever he's doing, or he wants to conquer the neighbor. And to do that, he has to have soldiers or workers and he has to pay them. And these people are on the move, they're not at home, so they need to be able to obtain their stuff. And in part, again, of course, you can have a baggage train and you can do stuff in kind, but generally you will find that you want to pay them in basic rations that they need along the way. And then eventually more and more these basic units also become things that, they go to foreign lands, they want to be able to buy stuff there when they're not just looting. They want to be able to exchange in a more effective way. And so this is also a major driver of monetization. And what you find ultimately is that the historic tendency for money is to join these two aspects together. So money becomes more and more complex because it becomes more and more the same thing as allowing a means of exchange and allowing a means of payment. And then additionally, it's also a store of value, which is just a way of saying you can also hoard it and you can keep it. And then later it will still be worth something. What is, as an aside, just a little world building aside, what is not correct is to think that money is predominantly gold pieces. This is again like a
Yes.
funny D&D invention, right? That like everything is paid in gold pieces. Money has taken all sorts of forms historically. As I mentioned, it's important to distinguish what kind of money we're talking about. But when we're thinking about your classic sort of typical money that does all of these things at once in a more or less, reasonably monetized market economy of some kind, like your typical high fantasy setting, it makes a lot more sense to use silver. Historically, silver is sort of the most common default, I would say, for money, because it's just valuable enough to be interesting. It's also quite easy to work with. It's quite light to transport and it's quite widely available, right? So silver is quite good for this. Gold has the downside. It was used. I mean, gold coins have existed historically, but gold coins have the downside of being too expensive almost. If things are too valuable, then they're not so useful, right, for smaller transactions. So you're always wanting to find a sort of like what's useful, what can we easily subdivide, what has the right kind of size for what is practical. What you also find
Mm.
is bronze, for example. The Romans used bronze a lot. The Greeks, I believe, also copper. Our own modern Small change is a lot of it is copper, I think, with nickel and other crap. I don't know exactly, but it's something like this. Iron has been used also, all sorts of things like this. Doesn't have to be gold pieces. Doesn't have to take a coin shape either. This is just, yeah, this is just very culturally specific. You can go nuts with this. It's just helpful, I think, in terms of world building to think about these two aspects of money, whether they are the same in your society or they're different ones and how they work.
Mm.
So these are basically summarizing again the questions that I have already asked. I think I don't need to repeat this again, and we also don't have time for that. I will skip the stuff about finance. This is about like how you get interest-bearing loans. Historically, people give loans for firstly for the long-distance trade to finance the long-distance trade. Secondly, for agriculture to even out harvest irregularities. These are probably historically the first sort of big interest-bearing loans. Or sort of reasons to have interest-bearing loans. And these already exist in Babylonia and in ancient Egypt, and the Greeks already also did a lot of this stuff, like even insurance and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go into all of that right now, but it's just useful to know like financialization and everything that comes with finance and with credit and so forth, so on and so forth, is ultimately a sort of, huge development of this, of these ideas.
Mm.
And yeah, and then I wanted to point out here, I guess the other point is that in terms of when we're talking about long distance trade routes, I think very important for people to remember, just for their own world building understanding, the money is in the intermediaries. What you want when you have a long distance trade route, usually it's via a couple of people, right? It goes from A, B, C, D to E and back. What you want to be is B, C, and D, essentially. Because, and especially you want to be the intermediary that people cannot get around. Because anybody who's an intermediary that people cannot get around for physical reasons, you control the mountain pass, whatever, imagine something like
Mm-hmm.
this, right? Or, you have to go via this port, and this is just how it works. Um, these people can charge enormous rents. It's called a
Right.
rent because essentially they can surcharge, right? Because it has to go via them, and so they can surcharge because people essentially have a captive or captive market in a sense. And so there's a lot of money in doing that. And so ultimately you set the terms of trade, and there can be multiple such layers in between. And very historically relevant is this for European colonization, for example, which began before the actual conquest of a lot of land, except in the Americas, but I'm talking now Eurasia, with Europeans inserting themselves into these existing trade routes and making themselves the intermediaries, the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and so forth. And they get very rich on this. And before
Mm.
that, the Venetians, the Genoese did this in Europe, and then before that, the Byzantines did this a lot. And even the between the Romans and India and China, there are people who are doing this. That's just a sort of general note. Yeah, this is just talking about like over time you find that there's more and more abstraction because you trade more and more with anonymous people, with people you don't know. More and more of it looks like the long distance trade version and less of it like the local version. So that ultimately you end up in a society where more and more stuff is tradable, more and more stuff is all traded for money, more and more stuff is also produced to be traded for money, just like long distance goods usually are. And then when that becomes all of society or almost all of society, then you get a society where social relations between people appear almost entirely as material relations between things, because everything is now expressible as some form of exchange. Everything is expressible in some ratio of one, of money for another thing, which is
Mm.
one way you can define capitalism. I don't have a lot of time left for the power aspect of it, so I'm gonna go in very broad strokes here. I'll just mention a couple points. But this is also, I think, more obvious and more intuitive to a lot of world builders. This is more the politics side, so I don't need to elaborate on this quite as much, I think. I just wanted to mention again that when you have a surplus, you usually, not necessarily, but usually historically have exploitation, which means that you have people who live off this surplus. This means that they can do other stuff. You can get very variegated kind of cultural, religious, whatever social roles, go nuts. Any amount of roles that you can have but then you need to think about what do these people live on and how does that stuff get to them. For example, people bring stuff to the temple, right? And then part of it is sacrificed to the gods and the priests get the rest of it, or something like this. Just an example, right? And it's also like palace redistribution systems where they tax a large amount of the agricultural harvest and they give some of it back to the peasants, and all the other stuff goes to the scribes who do the writing and put stuff on cuneiform, and go to the astrologers who look at the stars, and etc. This is sort of like a way you can sort of think about what kind of roles there can be, but it's always useful to then think about how does this tie into production and distribution. The other thing is talking about the source of conflict. All of these things are sources of conflict, right? So because of whoever does a particular kind of production, say the women do the taro stamping and the men do the hunting, or whatever the division is, you have 90% peasants and you have your 5% monks and your 5% knights and nobles, right? There are all sorts of varieties of this kind of thing. You can ad infinitum come up with them, but there are always basically two sort of sources of conflict here. Either people want to go up in, or basically a couple kinds of conflicts. You want to go up on the ladder with the ladder as it is, especially at the individual level. But at a group level, people want to either increase their share of the pie as it is, right? I mean, they just usually, this is actually much more common historically than the other kind, is that people accept the society as it is because they're born into its norms, into its institutions, they understand it, but they just want to have a bigger part of what they think they are owed, right? The social obligation part comes into this. Or the other version, which is where people challenge what are the rules of the production and distribution, right? It's like, why is it that you get to hang out in monasteries and do nothing, and we are sitting on the land? Let's invent the Reformation to not have this. I mean, this is obviously stupid and simplified, but as a manner of thinking, right? It's sort of like, this is the sort of, you could say, the revolutionary kind of conflict. And like I said at the beginning, and this is also where I want to end on, conflict over these things in all of its aspects, and conflict, the kind of distributional and ultimately also production, but it usually manifests itself obviously most in distribution kind of conflicts, are huge drivers of social change. I would say 80% of all social change in history is because of this stuff. They're huge drivers of conflict and interaction at a social level, and because of that they are very major powers also for narrative interest. Because it is conflict, it is also a way of setting up your society so that it's not just static. People are like this is our culture, this is how they think, this is how they work, which is a tendency for world builders to do, but also to think about how does it change, how do people agitate against this, and why would they do that. And that's where I'm going to end. Oh, I wanted to snap my fingers. There we go. Because I have only a couple minutes left.
Wow. Well, very, very good job.
Thank you. I hope that this was in any way not too fast and too high level, but at least I hope this
good.
Sort of helps you think a little bit how to think economically. That was
Yeah,
my way
I definitely feel like I really appreciate now how much it does actually just happen organically, just kind of from first principles and from very sort of practical considerations. And yeah, I think you've given a lot of really interesting avenues that you can explore if you think about the economics. Like I particularly like the idea of how the development of technologies could be influenced by the needs of the society. Yeah, all very good stuff.
I wish I'd left more time for Q&A, but with only an hour and a half, it's pretty rough. Rough going. I will maybe have to find some kind of other opportunity to talk more about this stuff if people are interested. And of course, you can just message me or whatever. Just to come back to James.
Asking for
yeah, I know. To come back to James Oakley's point, unfortunately, I don't really have, unlike most of the other people here, a YouTube channel as such. I have done some streaming in the past, but it was all games streaming. So I only use my YouTube for storing my VODs for gaming. I have thought about maybe starting some kind of channel of my own, and the world building stuff really excites me also. And if I get such a positive response, then maybe I should do something with this. So I think it's worth contemplating. If people have ideas of things that they think I should talk about or make videos about or whatever, I would be super interested in hearing what people would love to hear and what people think I could usefully contribute. I would be more than happy to do it because I do like streaming and streaming culture. So I can't really I mean, I can say register, I don't know, subscribe to my OnlyFans or something, but I don't really have like, I don't really have a Patreon or a YouTube or something that is suitable for this quite yet. But if there is enough interest, then of course I can make one. Right?
Yeah, and I'll be happy to send people your way if and when that happens.
Thank you. Yeah, and if there were, I guess you have some more questions you wanted to ask. Maybe we have. Well, we have only 1 minute left, right?
We have
Maybe maybe
55
we can also.
seconds.
Yeah, maybe we can also use some of the end of the pillar economy session when we will also be talking about economics, and we can get to these questions and apply them practically. That's sort of part of what I'm
Yeah, I'm
interested in
looking
doing, of
forward
course,
to
right?
seeing like
And
an
this may be
example of that.
exactly, this may be an opportunity also for people to talk, give me more questions. I'm sorry that I took up all the time. It's really
No,
difficult
don't worry
not
about
to with such a big topic.
Yeah, yeah. But no, that's all very well and good. Thank you very much for that. That was great.
You're welcome.
And now I have not set up the redirect properly, so I'm just in chat. If I can do that, can I do? Come on, StreamYard. If you click that link, it should take you right on to the religion stream, which is happening now.
Awesome.
I think. Cool. Well, thank you very much. We're 22 seconds over time, so I will say goodbye to everyone and see you in 2 hours. Or no,
Bye-bye.
1 hour. Cool. Bye-bye.